5 innocent teenagers confessed to a brutal crime they didn't commit. The Central Park Five spent decades in prison while the real rapist walked free. When DNA finally exposed the truth, it revealed the darkest chapter in New York's justice system. This is the story that changed America forever. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose injustice and demand reform. Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise, ages 14 to 16 when arrested for a brutal rape they didn't commit, spent decades in prison before DNA proved their complete innocence. Trisha Mealy, 28-year-old investment banker known as the Central Park Jogger, brutally attacked while running in 1989, survived against all odds but had no memory of the assault or her attackers. Linda Fairstein, head of Manhattan DA's Sex Crimes Unit, led the prosecution against the Central Park Five, built the case entirely on coerced confessions despite no physical evidence linking the teens to the crime. Matias Reyes, serial rapist and the real Central Park attacker, remained free for 13 years while 5 innocent teens served his sentence. Finally confessed in 2002, exposing the greatest wrongful conviction in New York history. A prisoner's worst nightmare isn't being guilty. It's being innocent and having no way to prove it. The Central Park Five were convicted by a city's rage, not by evidence. Their story exposed the darkest side of American justice. April 19, 1989. New York City was a powder keg waiting to explode. Crime rates had skyrocketed throughout the 1980s, crack cocaine had devastated entire neighborhoods, and racial tensions simmered just beneath the surface of daily life. The city that never slept was having nightmares about violence, and nowhere felt safe anymore. Central Park, the 843-acre oasis in the heart of Manhattan, should have been a refuge from urban chaos. On that warm spring evening, joggers traced familiar paths through the park's winding trails. Couples walked hand in hand past the reservoir, and families enjoyed the first truly pleasant weather of the year. Among those in the park that night was Trisha Mealy, a 28-year-old investment banker who had made jogging through Central Park part of her daily routine. Intelligent, ambitious, and dedicated to her career at Salomon Brothers, Trisha represented everything that New York promised to young professionals willing to work hard and dream big. At approximately 9 p.m., Trisha entered the park near 84th Street and 5th Avenue, beginning what should have been a routine 4-mile run through the park's northern loop. She was wearing a Walkman, light running clothes, and the confident stride of someone who had run this route hundreds of times before. She would not be seen alive and conscious again until she awakened from a coma 12 days later. At the same time Trisha was beginning her run, a group of teenagers from Harlem had also entered Central Park. They were between the ages of 14 and 16. Kids who should have been worried about homework and weekend plans, not creating headlines that would define their lives for decades to come. The group included Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise. They came from working-class families in Harlem and the Bronx, neighborhoods where opportunities were scarce and the path to trouble was well-worn. But they weren't hardened criminals. They were just teenagers doing what teenagers do, hanging out with friends and looking for something to occupy their time. What exactly happened in Central Park that night remains a matter of dispute even today. The teenagers later claimed they were wilding, a term that described groups of young people roaming through public spaces, sometimes causing minor disturbances or petty crimes. Some witnesses reported seeing groups of teenagers harassing cyclists and joggers, though the severity and scope of these incidents were later heavily disputed. What is not in dispute is that at approximately 1:30 a.m. on April 20th, 1989, two men walking through the park discovered Trisha Mealy's brutally beaten and unconscious body in a ravine near the reservoir. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten with a rock and stick, and left for dead in conditions so horrific that responding officers initially assumed she was deceased. Trisha was rushed to Metropolitan Hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save her life. She had lost approximately 75% of her blood, suffered severe hypothermia, and sustained traumatic brain injuries that left her in a coma with little hope of recovery. The attack was so savage that many medical professionals doubted she would survive, and if she did, whether she would ever function normally again. The discovery of Trisha's body sent shockwaves through New York City. The brutality of the attack, combined with the fact that it had occurred in Central Park, supposedly one of the city's safer public spaces, triggered a media frenzy and public outcry unlike anything the city had seen in years. Within hours, newspaper headlines screamed about wilding and wolf packs terrorizing Central Park. Television news broadcasts featured breathless reports about gangs of teenagers roaming the city's most famous park, attacking innocent victims with impunity. The story had everything that sold newspapers and attracted viewers: violence, race, sex, and fear. The pressure on the New York Police Department to solve the case quickly was immense. Mayor Ed Koch demanded results. Police Commissioner Benjamin Ward promised swift justice. Detective Linda Fairstein, head of the Manhattan District Attorney's Sex Crimes Unit, vowed to prosecute the attackers to the full extent of the law. The investigation that followed was driven more by public pressure and political necessity than by careful police work. Within 24 hours of Trisha's discovery, police had arrested several teenagers who had been in the park that night, including the 5 who would become known as the Central Park 5. The arrests were based primarily on the fact that these teenagers had been in Central Park around the time of the attack, and that some of them had allegedly been involved in other minor incidents earlier that evening. But there was no physical evidence linking any of them to Trisha's assault. No witnesses who could identify them as her attackers, and no clear timeline that placed them at the scene of the crime. What followed was one of the most controversial police investigations in New York City history. The 5 teenagers were separated from their parents and subjected to hours of intensive interrogation by experienced detectives who were convinced of their guilt before the questioning even began. Antron McCrae was 15 years old, a quiet kid who loved basketball and had never been in serious trouble before. During his interrogation, detectives told him repeatedly that his friends had already confessed and implicated him in the attack. They promised him that if he admitted his involvement, he could go home to his family. After hours of questioning without his parents present, Antron finally told police what they wanted to hear: that he had been involved in the attack on Trisha Mealy. Kevin Richardson was 14, the youngest of the group, a good student who played trumpet in his school band. Detectives used similar tactics on Kevin, telling him that cooperation was his only chance to avoid serious consequences. They suggested that he might not have actually participated in the rape, but that he was present when it happened. Kevin, exhausted and frightened, eventually agreed to this version of events. Yusef Salam was 15, an intelligent kid who was interested in writing and poetry. He was also the only one of the 5 who refused to sign a written confession, though he did make incriminating statements that were videotaped by police. Yusef maintained his innocence throughout the interrogation, but detectives interpreted his denials as evidence of his guilt rather than his innocence. Raymond Santana was 14, a kid who had gotten into minor trouble before but had never been involved in anything violent. During his interrogation, Raymond was told that DNA evidence had already linked him to the crime. A complete lie, since no DNA evidence implicating any of the teenagers existed. Faced with what seemed like inevitable conviction, Raymond eventually confessed to participating in the attack. Corey Wise was 16, the oldest of the group and the only one who was legally an adult. He also had mild learning disabilities that made him particularly vulnerable to coercive interrogation techniques. Corey had not even been in Central Park that night. He had only gone to the police station to support his friend Yusuf. But once there, detectives decided he must have been involved and subjected him to the same aggressive questioning as the others. The confessions that emerged from these interrogations were riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. The teenagers gave different accounts of how the attack occurred, who participated, and what role each person played. Their descriptions of the crime scene didn't match the physical evidence, and their timeline of events was impossible to reconcile with the known facts. But to investigators and prosecutors who were convinced of the teenagers' guilt, these inconsistencies were evidence of deception rather than innocence. They assumed that the boys were lying to minimize their own involvement or to protect their friends. The case went to trial in 1990 amid a media circus that had already convicted the Central Park Five in the court of public opinion. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the confessions, since there was virtually no physical evidence linking the defendants to the crime. The DNA evidence found at the crime scene did not match any of the 5 teenagers. Hair samples found on Trisha's body did not match any of the defendants. There were no fingerprints, no blood evidence, no witnesses who could positively identify any of the teenagers as Trisha's attackers. But prosecutor Elizabeth Lederer argued that the confessions were reliable and that the lack of physical evidence could be explained by the chaotic nature of the attack and the fact that multiple people had been involved. She painted a picture of a wolf pack of teenagers who had brutally assaulted Trisha Maley as part of a night of random violence in Central Park. The defense attorneys faced an uphill battle. They argued that the confessions had been coerced and were unreliable, but they struggled to overcome the emotional impact of the teenagers' own words describing the attack. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence, but prosecutors suggested that this was simply the result of the teenagers being careful to avoid leaving traces. The trials were conducted in a racially charged atmosphere that made fair consideration of the evidence nearly impossible. The teenagers were portrayed not as individuals, but as representatives of everything that frightened white New Yorkers about young Black and Latino men. The case became a symbol of urban decay, racial conflict, and the supposed breakdown of law and order in America's cities. Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, and Raymond Santana were tried together and convicted of assault, robbery, riot, and rape charges. They received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years in prison. Yusuf Salam and Corey Wise were tried separately because Corey was 16 and could be prosecuted as an adult while Yusuf was still considered a juvenile. Both were convicted, with Yusuf receiving 5 to 10 years and Corey receiving 5 to 15 years. The harshest sentence of all because of his adult status. The convictions were celebrated by many New Yorkers who saw them as justice for a horrific crime. But they were also criticized by civil rights advocates who argued that the teenagers had been railroaded by a criminal justice system that was more interested in finding scapegoats than in finding the truth. The 5 teenagers entered the prison system as children and emerged as young men whose lives had been fundamentally altered by their experience behind bars. They had missed crucial years of education, socialization, and normal adolescent development. They had been branded as rapists and violent criminals, labels that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Antron McCrae served 6 years in juvenile facilities before being released in 1996. He struggled to readjust to life outside prison and to overcome the stigma of his conviction. Finding work was nearly impossible, as potential employers consistently rejected applicants with violent felony convictions. Kevin Richardson also served 6 years and faced similar challenges upon release. The quiet, studious teenager who had played trumpet in the school band had been transformed by the prison experience into a young man who struggled with anger, depression, and difficulty trusting others. Raymond Santana served 5 years in juvenile facilities and was released in 1995. He attempted to rebuild his life but found that the conviction followed him everywhere he went. Employment opportunities were scarce, and he struggled with the psychological trauma of his experience. Yusef Salam served nearly 7 years before being released in 1997. He had used his time in prison to educate himself and had developed an interest in Islam and social justice issues. But like the others, he found that society was unwilling to give him a second chance. Corey Wise, who had received the longest sentence because he was tried as an adult, served 12 years in adult prisons, a brutal experience that left him with lasting psychological scars. Adult prison was far more violent and dangerous than the juvenile facilities where the others had been held, and Corey endured beatings, sexual assault, and years of psychological torture. Throughout their incarceration, all 5 men maintained their innocence. They participated in rehabilitation programs, earned educational credentials, and tried to use their time productively. But they never wavered in their claims that they had been wrongly convicted. Their families never stopped believing in their innocence and never stopped fighting for their exoneration. The mothers of the Central Park 5, particularly Dolores Wise, Corey's mother, became advocates for their sons and for other victims of wrongful conviction. The case took a dramatic turn in 2002 when Matias Reyes, a convicted murderer and serial rapist serving life in prison, contacted prosecutors and confessed to being the sole perpetrator of the Central Park jogger attack. Reyes had never been a suspect in the original investigation, despite the fact that he had committed similar crimes in the same area of Central Park both before and after the attack on Trisha Maylee. Reyes's confession was initially met with skepticism by prosecutors and police who had invested their careers in the convictions of the Central Park 5. But DNA testing quickly confirmed that Reyes was indeed the source of the biological evidence found at the crime scene, and that none of the 5 convicted men had contributed to that evidence. Further investigation revealed that Reyes's confession contained details about the crime that had never been made public, and that matched the physical evidence in ways that the teenager's confessions never had. He knew where the attack had occurred, how Trisha had been restrained, what weapons had been used, and other specifics that only the actual perpetrator could have known. The revelation that Matias Reyes was the real Central Park rapist meant that the Central Park 5 had spent a combined total of over 40 years in prison for a crime they had not committed. Their confessions, which had seemed so convincing to juries and the public, had been false, the product of coercive interrogation techniques applied to frighten teenagers who had no understanding of the consequences of their words. On December 19, 2002, the convictions of all 5 men were vacated by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. After more than a decade of insisting on their guilt, the criminal justice system finally acknowledged that Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise were innocent. The exonerations were a vindication for the Central Park Five and their families, but they could not undo the damage that had been done. The men had lost crucial years of their lives, had been branded as violent criminals, and had suffered psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The case also exposed serious flaws in the criminal justice system that had allowed 5 innocent teenagers to be convicted based on coerced confessions and a complete absence of physical evidence. It raised uncomfortable questions about the role of race in American justice and the willingness of prosecutors and police to cut corners when they faced public pressure to solve high-profile crimes. In 2003, the Central Park Five filed a civil lawsuit against New York City, arguing that they had been wrongfully convicted as a result of police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, and systematic violations of their constitutional rights. The lawsuit detailed the coercive interrogation techniques that had been used to extract their confessions and argued that city officials had known or should have known that the teenagers were innocent. The city fought the lawsuit for over a decade, spending millions of dollars on legal fees rather than acknowledging wrongdoing. City officials continued to insist that the teenagers had been involved in the attack despite the DNA evidence and Matias Reyes' confession. Finally, in 2014, the city agreed to settle the lawsuit for $41 million, approximately $1 million for each year the 5 men had spent in prison. The settlement was one of the largest wrongful conviction payouts in American history, but it came with no admission of guilt or wrongdoing by the city. The Central Park Five used their settlement money and their newfound platform to advocate for criminal justice reform and to help other victims of wrongful conviction. They established foundations and educational programs designed to prevent similar injustices from occurring in the future. Antron McCrae became an advocate for juvenile justice reform, working to ensure that young people in the criminal justice system receive proper legal representation and are not subjected to coercive interrogation techniques. Kevin Richardson pursued a career in music and used his experiences to educate young people about the importance of understanding their legal rights. Yusuf Salam became a motivational speaker and criminal justice advocate, traveling around the country to share his story and to call for reforms to prevent wrongful convictions. Raymond Santana started a clothing line and became involved in various business ventures while also speaking out about his experiences and advocating for reform. Corey Wise, who had served the longest sentence, established the Corey Wise Innocence Project at the University of Colorado Law School to provide legal assistance to other victims of wrongful conviction. The story of the Central Park Five has been told and retold in documentaries, books, and dramatic productions that have helped to educate the public about the dangers of wrongful conviction and the need for criminal justice reform. Their case became a symbol of how fear, prejudice, and prosecutorial ambition can combine to destroy innocent lives. In 2012, documentary filmmaker Ken Burns released The Central Park Five, a comprehensive examination of the case that featured interviews with the 5 men, their families, and many of the key players in the original investigation and prosecution. The documentary helped to renew public interest in the case and to cement the legacy of the Central Park Five as symbols of both injustice and redemption. In 2019, filmmaker Ava DuVernay created When They See Us, a Netflix limited series that dramatized the experiences of the Central Park Five from their arrest through their exoneration. The series reached a global audience and sparked renewed conversations about racial bias in the criminal justice system and the treatment of young people in police custody. The Central Park Five case also contributed to broader reforms in police interrogation practices, particularly regarding the questioning of juveniles. Many jurisdictions now require that juveniles have attorneys present during interrogations, and that all interrogations be videotaped to prevent coercive tactics. The case has been cited in academic studies of wrongful convictions, and has become a standard example of how multiple system failures can combine to produce tragic outcomes. It demonstrates the dangers of tunnel vision in police investigations, the unreliability of confession evidence, and the way that public pressure can corrupt the pursuit of justice. Today, all five of the Central Park Five have rebuilt their lives and have become successful advocates for justice reform. They have turned their traumatic experience into a force for positive change, working to ensure that other innocent people do not suffer the same fate they endured. Trisha Maylee, the Central Park jogger, recovered from her injuries and went on to become an advocate for brain injury survivors. She wrote a book about her experience and has spoken publicly about the importance of focusing on healing rather than revenge. While she has expressed sympathy for the Central Park Five and their wrongful convictions, she has also maintained that she has no memory of the attack and cannot speak to what actually happened that night. The Central Park Five case remains one of the most significant wrongful conviction cases in American history. It serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of rushing to judgment, the importance of following evidence rather than emotions, and the catastrophic consequences that can result when the criminal justice system fails to live up to its obligations. The story of five teenagers who were convicted by a city's fear rather than by facts continues to resonate today, serving as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration for those who believe that justice, however delayed, must ultimately prevail. Their names, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise, are now synonymous with the fight against wrongful conviction and the ongoing struggle to create a more just and equitable criminal justice system. They were prisoners of prejudice who became champions of truth, proving that even the gravest injustices cannot permanently destroy the human spirit's capacity for resilience and redemption.